So tonight's reading is about Joseph. If we wanted to put the entire reading of Joseph into our reading for tonight, we would start with Genesis 37 and we'd go all the way through Genesis 50. We're supposed to be done by 7 p.m. so we can get to pastries and apple cider. So I'm not going to read all of that. We just have a selection, really the beginning and the end of the Joseph story. What I want you to remember is as we've been working our way through the Bible this week, right? Or this fall, we had Genesis 1, 2, and 3, which was talking not how it scientifically we were created, but who is God and what are we created for? God is God. We are the created and called to steward and take care of, so all can not just survive, but actually thrive. And that story of Adam and Eve is more about who are we going to trust? If God calls us very good, do we trust that? Or do we listen to other voices in the Genesis 3 story of the serpent that says, don't trust God. There's more. Don't trust God. Who are you going to trust, right? So to me, that's the essence of sin. So we talked about it's not that these stories happened. It's that these stories are happening. We are still faced with that serpent in the world that says, you are not enough. Don't trust what God has said. But your life would be complete if you had, right? Then we talked about Noah. I'm not going to get into it because it's complicated, but it's not so much about that the flood occurred, but what is it said about God? God's not going to do it again. And then we get into Abraham. And this is where I said, I believe history actually enters into the Bible. These other stories are about, they're more myths than anything else. History starts to enter into Abraham. Not that it is a literal, factual account of what happened. We need to remember that. These authors weren't writing to convey, this is right, they wrote to convey who God is, who we are. And most of these stories were not written down until about the 5th century BC. So Genesis was not the oldest, is not the oldest book in the Bible. There's some that are much older than it. And this is where we get to Joseph. Abraham, remember we said, God, it's the first time you could break the wheel. You could do something else. Life isn't just this cycle. Sun goes up, sun comes down. Sun goes up, sun goes down. Right? Fall, winter, spring, winter. I got those in wrong order, didn't I? Spring, summer, fall, winter. It's not just a cycle. But God has a bigger path for us to follow. And so Abraham actually gets up and moves. That's unheard of at that time. You didn't get up and move. Abraham gets up and moves. And so we had all those stories about Abraham's family, Abraham's kids, and we heard Jacob and Esau and Rachel and Leah and all of it. Story of Isaac. And now we get to one of Abraham's descendants, Joseph. I'm going to read the story, and then we're going to talk about what is the purpose of the Joseph story. Okay? So how it begins and how it ends. This is the story of the family of Jacob, which is one of Abraham's descendants. Joseph, being 17 years old, was shepherding the flock with his brothers. He was a helper to the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel, Jacob, loved Joseph more than any other of his children, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a long robe with sleeves. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his other brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Once Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more, because he said to them, "Listen to the dream I just dreamed." There they were, binding sheaves in the field, and suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright. Then your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to have dominion over us?" So they hated him even more because of his dreams and his words. We jump ahead a little bit. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the long robe with sleeves that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty, and there was no water there. That's how it begins, right? I'm going to tell you the rest of the story. Here's how it ends. So they went out of Egypt and came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan. And they told him, "Joseph is still alive. He is even ruler over the land of Egypt." He was stunned. He could not believe them. But when they told him all the words of Joseph that he had said to them, and when he saw the wagons that Joseph had sent him to carry him, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. Jacob, said, "Enough! My son Joseph is still alive, and I must go and see him before I die." I need to get my notes. If I'm going to tell you the entire story of Jacob, it's not short. But what we need to understand about the story of Jacob. Anybody Marvel movie fans here? Mark, Livezum, Bill, Jonathan, are you even listening back there? I'm looking at music. Do you like the Marvel movies? I do, some of them. I just saw, I don't know if it's the most recent one, Black Widow. It's now on Disney+. But there's something about all the Marvel movies and how they really began. They began with Iron Man. And part of the reason why Iron Man was so fascinating is that whole movie, the first one, was his origin story, right? How he became Iron Man. And so that's what so much of that movie is about, and him understanding and getting his own identity. But it's his origin story. We need to understand so many of these Genesis stories are similar in that way. They are the origin story of the people of Israel. So these stories were written down during the Babylonian exile. So they've already settled in the land, right? And they have not been obedient. The Assyrians came in and took over the northern kingdom. Then the Babylonians came in and took over everything else. And so they're wondering, how did we get here? So many of these Genesis stories are geared toward answering that question, how did we get here? And Joseph bridges that gap. It actually is how the people got into the land that they were promised. It's what the story of Joseph does. So here's that story of Joseph, right? His brothers hated him. They wanted to kill him. One of them, Reuben, the oldest, said, let's not kill him, let's throw him in the pit. And what Reuben's plan was then, when he goes into the pit, he'll hang back and he'll rescue him. But what ends up happening, some slave traders come by, and they end up selling Joseph off into slavery. So Joseph goes off into Egypt. Does anyone know whose house he is, who he is sold to? Well done, Alice. It is Potiphar. So he is now a slave in Potiphar's household. Potiphar's wife tries to seduce Joseph. Joseph refuses. She tries to seduce him again. He refuses. She tries again. He refuses. So now in her anger, she accuses him of what she had been doing. Potiphar says, Joseph, essentially, you're my slave. What are you doing? That's my wife. Sends him to prison. Okay? So if you know the story of Potiphar, this is how Joseph gets to prison. This is how I think it's so important that we understand how these stories connect to one another. We know the story of the dream coat, right? We know the story of all these things, but how do they fit together? So Joseph is now in prison, and he's with two prisoners, a cupbearer and a baker. And they both have dreams, and they ask Joseph to interpret the dreams that they have. And Joseph says to the cupbearer, your dream means that you will get reinstated back into Pharaoh's good graces, and you will go back to work for Pharaoh. And he says to the baker, essentially, baker, you're about to be killed. Both things come true, and the cupbearer leaves, and Joseph says, please don't forget about me. What do you think the cupbearer does? Forgets about him, right? 2 years go by. Then Pharaoh has some dreams. And the dreams that Pharaoh has is he has a dream of 7 fatted calves, fatted cows, and 7 lean or skinny cows, and 7 full ears of corn, I guess you could say, and 7 really skimpy, weak ears of corn. He doesn't know what this means, and Potiphar then remembers, wait a minute, I knew Joseph a couple years ago in prison who interpreted my dream. Maybe he can interpret Pharaoh's dream. So Joseph gets called out, comes up, and says to Pharaoh, and interprets Pharaoh's dream. He says, this is what's going to happen. There's going to be 7 years of plenty, of harvest. You're not going to know what to do with all that you have. And then there's going to come 7 years of famine. And this actually happens, right? 7 years of plenty come, and Joseph convinces Pharaoh to put him in charge of pretty much overseeing the storage of the grain and the food and all that kind of stuff. And so Joseph grows in power and is in charge of all of this stuff. And then the famine comes. And now everybody comes to Pharaoh to get grain, to get food. But they don't go see Pharaoh. Who do they go see? They go see Joseph. So Joseph grows in wealth and power even more. And essentially, he buys up all the land, all the people on behalf of Pharaoh. Well, as this goes on, people in other lands are suffering this famine, right? So Joseph's brothers now need to come down and visit Egypt because they need grain and they need to go see Joseph. So they go through. They do not recognize Joseph at first, but Joseph recognizes them. And they need to buy grain. And so they do. And and they get it, and they leave. And then they eat all the grain. Oh, and when they go back, their satchels of money that they brought to buy the grain with are still full. So essentially, Joseph just gave his brothers the grain. They eat their fill, they run out. Father sends them back. So they go back. This time Joseph says, here's him talking about one of the younger brothers. I think it's Benjamin. And he's like, you know what? So I know you're telling the truth. Bring your younger brother Benjamin here. And, do they know at this point? I got to look at my notes now. Sorry. Not yet. I see Alice. You ought to be up here. They don't know yet. Yeah, he doesn't know yet, right? But they talk about, essentially they talk in Hebrew, Joseph's native language. Joseph understands it, but doesn't know that they understand it. And says, bring your younger brother down, Benjamin, so I know you're telling the truth. And I'm going to take Simeon, one of the brothers, and keep him hostage until you come back. So now the brothers go back, and this time they don't just have all their money, they have twice the amount of money that they went with. So Joseph gives them more again. They go back, they tell their father, and they eventually convince their father to let Benjamin go with. But they are really nervous because they are talking about what they did to Joseph when he was the youngest brother. And this is what kind of turns Joseph into their good graces. Is when Joseph requested for a younger brother to come, they talked amongst themselves in Hebrew about what they did and the remorse that they have for it. And so Joseph hears this, and that is what kind of motivates him to be extra generous. He senses their repentance from it. So they go back, they convince their brother, they bring Benjamin down, bring out Simeon, and now Joseph reveals, is this right, Alice? Oh, because you know what happens this time? There is the chalice. This is why you don't even have notes in front of you. They go back again, but this time what Joseph does, he hides a silver cup in the back of Benjamin and then sends somebody out after him to say he stole it. So they go back. So they go out, they get him, and the brothers are like, oh, we'll cooperate. They go back. And Judah says, don't take Benjamin, take me. kind of sacrificing himself for the younger brother. And this now really motivates. Am I okay here now, Alice, still? This really motivates them. And now, I believe at this point, Joseph reveals himself to them. And there is a reunion among everybody, right? This is still during the famine. The rest of Israel needs to come and buy grain. Not just Joseph and his whole clan, but everybody else. So what's interesting is it ends on a pretty happy note, right? All the Israelites come down, they're living in Egypt, and everybody's getting along. It really kind of wraps it up in a nice, pretty bow. Where Exodus picks up is now that Pharaoh that knew everybody, that was pleased with everything, has now died, and a new Pharaoh comes in that has a short memory. And the new Pharaoh looks out and says, oh my gosh, do you see how many Israelites are in the land? If we don't do something about it, they're going to realize how strong they are, and they're going to conquer us. They're going to enslave us. We better enslave them first. Does that make sense? So the whole point of Joseph, that whole story, the give and the take and being sold into slavery, the interpreting of the dreams, is to bring the Israelites to Egypt, which then, the next part of the story, right, that's where they get enslaved, that's where we get Moses, have to free them because they cry out to God. I don't want to get ahead of myself. But that's the whole part of Joseph. I don't know about you. Growing up, I knew Joseph. I knew, right, I've seen parts of the musical, Joseph, the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. I knew about the cupbearer or Joseph interpreting dreams and the 7 cows. I had no idea where it fit or what purpose it served. I don't know about you, but I didn't know any of that. And I think it helps if we know the larger purpose of what it serves and how we read these Genesis stories, that they are the origin stories to get the people into Egypt for then the next stage of that story to occur. That is not to say it didn't happen, but I am totally okay saying there's probably a lot of dramatic license being had. Right. Yeah. Yeah. So Joseph was the youngest. So what this says about God too, God always seems to choose the younger, right? Well, that he came after the fact, right? Yeah. Right. But Canaan, it was the younger one. Jacob and Esau, it was the younger one. Reuben is the oldest and should have been giving that blessing in which everybody is, all the tribes are named after the southern kingdom, Judah, which is when Israel is located. It should have been Reuben, but it's not. It's Judah, one of the younger sons. And so I think one of the things that this tells us about God is God seems to not always play according to who should be the powerful, but who are those that often get overlooked.
Well, you go back to Jacob. My goodness, all the things, he was not a good guy all the time.
None of them were.
None of us are.
None of us are.
Wait a minute. I'll speak for myself.
Right? But the whole point of Joseph is to get the people into Egypt. So then the Exodus can occur, right? So they're going to be put in slavery, and the Exodus now can occur. That's where we're going to pick up, is the people are in slavery, they cry out to God, and who does God call to help them? Moses, right? So it's just another piece in the puzzle as we get this whole thing put together. So I don't have so much a sermon, a preaching thing from it, or here's what you got to learn, except what's the grand story that's going on? How do all those pieces fit? All right? Excellent. Franklin.
I was also led to believe that Joseph was the peacemaker. Up to this point, it was like me for me and you for you and da-da-da.
Yeah, a lot of conflict between everybody.
Joseph is like, let's stop this right now.
Yeah. A lot of conflict between them, and Joseph doesn't do that. Joseph actually ends up welcoming, the people who harmed him. he doesn't. He doesn't retaliate in that way.
If I remember correctly, it says right in the Bible, he gives again the gift to God. I mean, that's why it happened.
Yeah, he forgives. Absolutely.